When I talk to people about setting aside the financial part, cloud versus on-prem,
which can be a big difference.
It can be a big difference.
But
what I
continue.
tell people, whether it's public cloud or private cloud providers, that the thing that you get from the cloud that you're not going to get as a small to mid-size operation is you get enterprise class infrastructure and people supporting that infrastructure. We still occasionally run into customers that, hey, there's a rack of servers in the closet over here. That's the prime candidate for cloud.
Glen Kendall here with another episode of Data and Confused. Today, I'm going to be talking with Randy Knight from SSG or SQL Solutions Group. And he and his company focus on Microsoft SQL Server and database performance and really all things SQL. So enjoy this episode. Randy Knight, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Glenn. Always great to see you.
So today I'm joined with Randy Knight from SQL Solutions Group. So Randy, tell me about SQL Solutions Group and what you guys do.
So we are a consulting company and managed service provider focused solely on the Microsoft data platform, right? So SQL Server, all of its flavors, on-prem, Azure, both Azure, SQL Server on VMs, Azure SQL Database, managed instance. We're starting to get into Fabric a little bit from a administrative standpoint. So we're very focused on one thing, and all of us have been doing that for a very long time. I started with SQL Server in 1996, I believe. We try to do one thing and do it as well as anybody.
Yeah, I've probably around the same time as when I first started to use SQL Server as well, but and have done some development and whatnot in it down through the years, and so I know enough to be dangerous, so they might say. But so yeah, thank you for joining me today on Data and Confused, and I invited you because I think SQL Server is one of those things that there does tend to be a lot of confusion over, just because of the complexity, I would say, of all the different things that can be going on within a SQL database, especially if it gets to be a certain size. You have a lot of data moving, different kinds of things happening. So as we start to dive into some of these different areas, is there something that you typically run into with your customers as far as performance, or just things that, because I would imagine that people typically call you in when, things are on fire, things that start to go sideways. They can't manage SQL themselves. It's gotten to a point where it's become unmanageable. Is there typically one thing that causes that, or is it like death by 1,000 cuts?
It's, sometimes it's one thing, but it's more often death by 1,000 cuts. You're absolutely right that occasionally we'll have a customer who's like, hey, we're building this thing, we want to make sure we do it right, but that's not the norm. The norm is we have built this thing, and now we're having, and typically performance issues, right, are the ones that really kind of motivate people to like, okay, we need outside help. SQL Server is, in some respects, very easy to use from a standpoint of, install it, create some tables, from a development standpoint. But there's an awful lot under the hood, behind the scenes, best practices that just gets missed, right? And so a lot of times, one of our most typical customer profiles are SaaS vendors, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
We and relatively young in their journey, SaaS vendors, right? Startup, they're usually at the point where, they have some equity funding, things like that. And they've grown to the point where, we built this thing and we become victims of our own success, right?
They have some data in there now,
once
some
you
customers,
have a bunch of data,
contention.
a bunch of customers, concurrency.
Yeah.
The things that you could get away with a small volume, you can't get away with anymore, right? And a lot of times, especially I think in 2025 and over the last probably 5 to 10 years, the DBA role has kind of gone out of focus, right?
Really?
That from a standpoint of companies having a DBA, right? And so you have this concept of what we call the accidental DBA, right? Where there's a developer or a sysadmin who kind of got tasked with that and learned some things, but they're self-taught. They haven't really had anybody there to mentor them and so forth. So that's a pretty typical customer profile for us in that they don't have a DBA, they have all these issues, and it's technical debt, right? Which we see technical debt all over the place, and I think data is one of the places that you really see a lot of technical debt.
Yeah, I mean, so if they had a DBA, say they had you or a DBA to start with, are these things that they could have got in front of?
Absolutely, right? When we build an environment, either a new environment or we're doing a migration, right? That's one of the pretty common projects for us is an upgrade migration.
Right, like
between
move from
versions.
one version of
Yeah, from
SQL to another, like 2012 or
2019 to
something. Yeah,
2022, or migration between data centers or between on-prem and the cloud, right? So we have, a pretty good template in terms of how we do these projects and how we set things up and how we do things, just in terms of best practices for creating a SQL Server environment, right? So that's one thing, right? And when you just go click, 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 install SQL Server, a whole bunch of that stuff gets missed, right? The other area is understanding how SQL Server works and what that means for when you write your database code, right? Everything from your schema, tables, indexes, to your actual T-SQL queries, whether it be stored procedures and so forth.
so when you
SQL
say,
is a
yeah,
very
when you
different.
say,
Yeah, go ahead.
when you say how SQL Server works,
Yep.
so just elaborate on that a little bit. Are you talking about like how queries are made, like the query optimizer, or?
Yeah, like how when you write a query and it first goes to the query optimizer that says, it's been said that SQL is a declarative language and most are procedural languages, meaning in a procedural language, you tell the computer what you want and how to do it.
Right.
And
Yep.
in a database, you just tell it what you want.
And it has to figure
And
out how to do it. Yeah.
its job is the how to do it, right?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so if you tell it what you want in suboptimal ways, it's going to make bad decisions, right? So
So it's declarative, but you can give it some hints and some nudges, maybe.
yeah, or just things that things as simple as the optimizer happens before it executes the query, so it can only operate on what it knows. And so one of the things we see quite often are things like implicit conversions, right? Where you have maybe a variable that's of one data type and your table column is of a different data type. And so it having to do that introduces overhead and things that if your data types, as simple as your data types are correct, and you didn't have to do that conversion either implicitly or explicitly, right? Things like loops versus sets, right? All relational databases function on relational algebra, which is set based, right? So instead of going through a million rows one at a time to do something, we want to do it all at once, or 100,000 at a time, or things like that. So
So are those things, because having done both, like if I'm learning, say, programming 101, I'm going to have a for loop, for example. I'm doing it procedurally, if you will. I'm going to have a for loop. Okay, I'm going to process these things sort of one at a time because that's how I'm used to processing things. Versus, like you say, like I'm going to do an optimal select statement or something like that that's going to grab everything that I want all at once.
exactly.
Is that accurate?
And
okay.
part of it is the way that programmers think and the way they're trained is different than the way SQL Server works. And so you kind of have to put on a different hat, and another great example of that are scalar user defined functions, which are something that Microsoft put into the product in like SQL 2000. And from a programmer's perspective, it makes all the sense in the world. That's how we're trained as developers, right?
So what is a
Reusable code.
scalar?
So it's a function that, like a function in any other language that, you pass in a variable or 2 or 10 or whatever, and it does a bunch of logic on it and it returns a single result, right? So the example I use in some of my demonstrations on this is you have an invoice table and you have a customers table, right? The invoice table has a customer ID and you want to create a report. So you say, hey, I'm going to create a function that I can pass in the customer ID and it will return the customer name. And so in my query, I now include that function. Well, what that does is it's now going to execute that function once per row in my table, right? Or in my query, right? And when we do things like we say, I'm going to put that in the predicate or the where clause, where function to give me the customer name equals Acme products. Now it's going to execute that function serially once per candidate row, right? To figure out what the customer name is. And so we've taken what looks to us like a, select from table with this function, which it checks all the buttons for a developer, right? It checks all the boxes, right? That, we're reusing code, we're removing complexity from this code, right? We're abstracting that logic. But it, all of a sudden, instead of saying customer ID equals and using an index to find all those customers in this table, we're now executing this scalar function a million times. And
Right.
of a million row table.
Yeah. So it sounds like Microsoft has added a lot of features. They have stuff like this to, be helpful, to let people, use it in, their preferred ways. But then they've also given them a gun that they can shoot themselves in the foot with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, stuff like that, it sounds like that's pretty hard to unwind, because if you've coded,
it can be.
If you've gone through and coded your whole SaaS application using things like this, it's like, all right, guys, this isn't just a matter of, the DBA comes in and rolls up his sleeves. It's like, all right, I'm going to go in and fix the plumbing. It's like, no.
Yeah. And we see that a lot. We do what we call full stack health checks, right? Where we go through and we identify all these problem areas, and that's easy for us to say, oh, look, you're using, here's this scalar function that's being called, 200,000 times a minute. And that's not an exaggeration. That's stuff that we see on a regular basis. So you need to stop doing that. Well, it's in, tens of thousands of lines of code, right? It's a lot easier to say stop doing that than it is to stop doing that, right? So, and Microsoft has continued to improve the product. In SQL 2019, they added some things for the optimizer to kind of try to help take apart that scalar function and make it more optimal. But there's only so much that you can do if you're forcing it. I want to do it this way, and not giving the optimizer the opportunity to come up with the best way to do what you're asking it to.
So if I am an accidental DBA, if I am not sure if we have the budget or the resources or whatever to try to bring in you guys in SSG and do this for us, how would I know? I know there's some tools that are out there, like third-party tools, like Brent Ozar has a script.
There's some great community tools out there. There's also some great, relatively inexpensive training out there, right? You bring up Brent Ozar. Brent's, I've known Brent for many years. He has what he calls the first responder kit, which is a collection of stored procedures that give you all kinds of information about what's going on. He also has some online training that, you can, he does a really good job of, for the accidental DBA. He has one presentation, I think it's something like, how to think like the engine, right? Which is essentially what we started with, right? Is that understanding how SQL Server works. So Brent's got some great stuff. There's another organization called SQL Skills that has some really kind of in-depth, hardcore training.
I came
And
across
then,
Eric Darling. I don't know if you've looked at his
yes,
stuff. He's another
yes,
one that
yep.
I
Eric has some
actually
good
did some
stuff.
training with, and
Yep.
he has some cool tools as
Yep.
well.
He has some. He has a one called SP Quickie Store, which is for the query store, right? So if you're using the query store, that's great. But the default reports that you get in SSMS only get you so far. And so he's got that. His community tool is SP Quickie Store, which allows you to query the query store data and kind of find out what's going on.
So let's talk about the query store. So I know it's not a new feature, but it's a relatively new feature. So talk about what is query store, what that has added,
Yep.
and what benefits you get of using that and sort of turning that on.
So Query Store was introduced in SQL Server 2016.
Yep.
So yeah,
almost
it's
almost
not,
10 years.
yeah, not
Yep.
super new, but it's not enabled by default. And that's one of the things that we see it often not being used, and it should be in most cases. It's enabled at the database level. And prior to Query Store, what did we have in terms of our ability as DBAs to go in and figure out what's going on, right? Well, we have the execution plan cache, right? So every time you execute a query, the first thing the optimizer does is it says, I'm going to come up with something called an execution plan, which is that how piece, right? We tell it what, it figures out how. And that is stored in an area of memory called the plan cache.
And then
right?
once it does that, it's going to continue to do it that same way
to reuse that
over
plan.
and over
Yes.
again until
Yep.
until
so-
the server's rebooted, or is there something that can
force
that?
Certainly, if the server's rebooted or the service is restarted, that's going to clear everything out. We also only have a certain amount of space for plan cache, right? So older plans will get removed as to make space for newer ones. We also, for the same query, the same execution plan may not be the right execution plan anymore. So if things have changed in terms of statistics and we could get into parameter sensitive plans and parameter sniffing and how you can end up getting what is sometimes called a bad plan, right? But so all execution plans are stored in the plan caches as XML. So we have some of Brent's stuff like SP Blitz cache, that's what it does. It pulls stuff out of the plan cache. We have things like extended events, and before that, SQL Server Profiler. What Query Store does is it takes a small part of your database and it stores execution plans for all of your queries, or as many of your queries as it can. And there's different ways to configure it. And so you have kind of this record of all the queries. And in SQL Server Management Studio, you have some built-in reports and things that allow you to see what's going on. Eric has his stuff. So that's one area, just to kind of see queries. The other issue is that you can do things like force plans. So if you get a query that, for some reason it's getting a bad plan that doesn't work the best all the time, you can say, I want this plan to be used, and you can say, always use that. So Query Store is something that most people aren't using, most people should be using. There are use cases in super outlier busy systems that, enabling Query Store, especially with just the defaults, could cause issues, but those are outliers. So Query Store.
Query Store good.
Query Store is good. Yep.
Yeah. So now you have access to all of these caches of the plans. And so you go in, you'll need some conceptual training first to figure out, okay, how does SQL Server work? Okay, it creates a plan before it executes anything. Well, what's the plan? Well, the plan is how it's getting the data. And then this is a record of that. This is how it decided it's going to get the data. It's going to use this index, or talked about parameter sniffing and stuff. Anyway, caches all of that. How then, again, for the accidental DBA, how it seems like that would be quite a challenge then to go into. Now you're looking at, these plan caches, and that seems like that would be, again, another level of sort of expertise that you would need to gain in
It
order to
is.
really understand what's
It
happening
is.
inside of these plan caches, and just to have the nuance to know, hey, this is bad that it's doing this, or no, I don't need to focus on this, is doing as good as it could do. How would a person even know what they don't know, I guess, when it comes to that, and know once they've reached
So I
the
think
limit
that's where
of
the training comes in, right? That,
yeah.
okay, I figured out how to look at an execution plan, but how do I know what's good or bad, right? Because an execution plan, there's a lot of different operators, and there's some are very basic, right? Like I'd rather see an index seek than a scan in most cases. And so there's all kinds of things like that. This is also where some of these tools come in, though, right? Like some of Brent's tools, or there is SQL Sentry Plan Explorer. SQL Sentry is a company they're now part of SolarWinds. They were acquired by SolarWinds a few years ago. And they have a bunch of different tools for SQL Server. But one of them is called Plan Explorer, which is kind of a better way to look at execution plans than what you get in Management Studio. And they do things like highlight, okay, this is the bad part, right? This is what is causing you the issues and things like that. So, but you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, we're touching on one area of performance here, right? That, DBA, whether you're an accidental DBA developer, it's an entire discipline in IT, in technology. And even within that, there are sub-disciplines, right? So at my company, SQL Solutions Group, right, we have, several consultants, and, we're all really good at this in general, but some of us are, I'm have a lot more experience. I'm a lot better than most on the infrastructure part, right? Setting up clusters and availability groups and security and things like that, you know, whereas we have, someone else who's, query performance, the stuff we've just been talking about is what he loves to do. He would do, if he could, that's all he would do all the time, right? So, and that's why for different issues with different customers, we bring in different people who kind of have that specialty.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, having myself kind of gone through and been an accidental DBA, that I think the training is great, the tools are great. Yes, there's all these resources out there, but realistically, 9 times out of 10 at least, you're not going to be able to figure out what's going on. Sure, maybe as an accidental DBA, you just have one thing that you can go in and you got lucky and you figured it out. But I think the thing that I found is that I actually think that it gives people sort of a false sense of confidence, false sense of security, that they think they know more than what they actually do. And I don't know. I feel like things have gotten so complex now that people need to have additional help and if they are serious about training, they almost need like lessons or an apprenticeship or something.
Yeah.
It's kind of like guitar, right? It's like,
Right.
I took up the guitar lessons, and there's tons of great resources on the internet, free videos, all those kind of things. And I started to learn and, put your hands in this position and all this sort of stuff. But it wasn't until that I actually started to take lessons in person that I started to get, I won't say good, but started to make progress, right?
Totally.
Because I needed somebody to give me that direct feedback to say, no, like you need to move your fingers like this,
right? And
your hand position needs to be here.
Mhm.
Where you're strumming, instead of doing this, do it like that, to give direct feedback. And I think if you don't have that, somebody seeing what you're doing, you don't see where your blind spots are. And then you're just spending hours, weeks, months going down these rabbit holes that you can't really figure it out on your own. And so you kind of have a false sense of...
For sure. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's like anything else. You need a mentor to become really good at something, right? Hands-on. And that's why, one of the things we do at SQL Solutions Group is we have what we call a coaching program. We purposely said, we're not going to go out and create training. There's a lot of people out there creating some great training already, right? But one of the things that happens with training is you go through training and it's very canned, right? It's Northwind traders, and this is what this database looks like. And then
Exactly.
you
Yep.
go back to your job
Yep.
and trying to figure out, okay, well, this is my actual environment, my actual database. How do I apply that? So what we do in our coaching programs is there's just like, 1 to 2 hour sessions where we work with you on what's going on in your environment. You got a performance issue with this query, let's tune it together, right? And so that program is to kind of try to help bridge that gap.
No, that's excellent. And I'm a big fan of that because I believe that, some people say, oh, I'm a visual learner, or I'm a this learner, I'm a that learner. And, I think that's all BS. Like, we learn by doing. So you need to do a thing in order to really learn it. Like you said, I can take all the Brent Ozark, and it's good to have that just to sort of learn the terminology and have a background, but you're not going to learn it. You're not going to absorb it, understand it, and then be able to be competent. I don't think, at least, until you actually can apply it to something, on a real project. So I think that's absolutely essential to have some real thing that you're working on. It's like, oh, I see now. This is how this actually connects. It's not theoretical. So yeah. Speaking of architecture, you talked about that's one of your areas of focus is around architectural elements of SQL Server. What are some of the things that SQL Server is good at from an database architecture standpoint, that I would want to use SQL Server if I'm a SaaS provider, whatever? I'm making a decision about the great tool. Do I want to go with Postgres or some other thing, or SQL Server? What are some of the things, because SQL Server ain't cheap, right? Especially in the cloud. So what are some of the things that are going to be worthwhile to invest in SQL Server from an
So
architecture standpoint?
I think SQL Server, you know, now open source has become really big. Postgres is huge, but historically it was kind of Oracle versus SQL Server, right? We had a lot of that, and there's still some of that. SQL Server was kind of built, from the get-go, like a lot of Microsoft products, to be user friendly, right? To, even comparing like, Windows and Linux, right? Like, and that's both good and bad. Like you said, you can do things and they're pretty easy to figure out how to do. And if you don't really understand what you're doing, you can get yourself into trouble, right? So I think SQL Server is definitely, particularly for like the accidental DBA, the developer, it's just going to be a lot easier to use, right? I think the community and the tools and just the knowledge base that's out there on SQL Server is gigantic compared to other platforms. So I think that's a big part of it. I think a lot of times it comes down to your whole development stack, right? If you're using .NET and for your application layer, it's going to integrate best with SQL Server, right? So
Is that best from a performance standpoint or best from a coding standpoint and support standpoint?
I think both. I think both. Compared to, and I'm not a Postgres expert by any stretch, but compared to some of these other platforms, the things that you want to do at an enterprise level, like high availability, disaster recovery, security, things like that. But for that same reason, when you have that kind of market share for that long, there's just a lot of things built around that. The question I always ask people when they talk about, hey, what database platform should I use? Is, okay, if it's something you're building yourself, what's your skill sets in-house versus what you're going to hire and things like that. What's your development stack, right? If it's a vendor product, the question that I always ask, especially when vendors come and they say, oh, we're database agnostic, right? You can put your database on Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, any of these. The question that I always say to ask is, what did you develop it in?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Because there's one that it's made to work with, and then
Right.
there's the others that are technically supported, but maybe
Right.
it's more of an edge
Right.
case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And then second to that would be, for your user base, what percentage is this platform versus this platform? This is versus this platform, right? Because all relational databases are similar, but they're not the same, right? And some of these intricacies of performance and execution plans and things like that are going to be different. There's, probably the platform I know the best besides SQL Server is Oracle. And there's stuff that you should do in Oracle because it works better that you specifically shouldn't do in SQL Server and vice versa.
Yeah, and it seems like SQL, just because it's been around for so long, probably, but it has so many little things that it can do that if you ever get stuck with something, like we ran into a thing the other day where the customer had a data in one SQL Server in a table, but they wanted that data restored from a different SQL Server. They just basically want to move one table to the other. So SQL Server, I don't know if they'll ever do this, but it would be nice if they did, doesn't have table level restore. So you can't take the data and just restore like you would a backup, that table. You have to clear out that table and then move the data over. But one of the cool things that we ended up doing is it's well, can you do linked server? It's well, yeah, actually we could do linked server. Oh, if you can do linked server, it's so much easier because now you can take advantage of that feature within SQL, which automatically connects those together. And then it has a pipeline, if you will, under the hood where you're able to move the data easily. And so having had that in place, it was easier to move. Otherwise, I don't know if Postgres has this or not, but if it had been some other system, I could imagine it's basically more of an export and then you got to import it sort of thing. And not that it's impossible to do, but I think there's little things like that, whether it's that or, replication. It just seems like there's a lot of these little featurettes, if you will, that allow you to...
There's a lot of things that are built into SQL Server that are extra tools with other vendors, right? That are, third party, and you got to decide what to use and what does it cost and things like that. So yeah, that's a great point.
And now in 2025, we've gone through this big cloud push over the last 10 years, really, but it's really over the last 5 years that it's really become more mainstream, where Microsoft wants you to put everything into Azure, including SQL Server. Is Azure the best place for SQL? Does on-prem still have a place?
I think the answer to that question is, we always joke as DBAs that there's the same answer to every question, and that answer is it depends, right?
Okay.
And I think the cloud definitely has its place, right?
Yep.
We have a lot of customers in, both major public clouds, Azure and AWS. We've had
Sorry, don't mean to forget AWS. Yes. You can run SQL in there too.
That's
I guess you could probably run it in GCP and Google too.
It really comes down to what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you're using, and I think with the cloud, you have to separate platform as a service offerings and infrastructure as a service, right? Infrastructure meaning, you're running virtual machines, right? And you're running Windows servers, Linux servers, whatever, on their hardware, their network, their everything else, right? And that becomes, one of the things that I think has been sold to, people, especially at the executive level, is, oh, you just put it in Azure or AWS and we take care of everything for you. And at least in the IaaS world, they take care of the hardware, right? You're outsourcing hardware, right? But you still have to know how to set up the network. You still have to set up the virtual machines and the storage and security and everything else. So it's just a different skill set, right, than you would have on-prem. When you get into platform as a service, that becomes more interesting, right? Because now you actually are outsourcing. So
what's the difference between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service?
So taking SQL Server, for example, infrastructure as a service or IaaS is, I'm going to have a virtual machine running in Azure or AWS or wherever, and it's going to be kind of the same as if it was a VM running on-prem, right? In that it's got SQL Server installed on it. I still have to manage that VM, right? I have an operating system I have to patch. I have SQL Server I have to patch. I also have all of the flexibility and control that I have on-prem. Platform as a service would be something like Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, or AWS has what they call RDS, which is, hey, here's a SQL Server platform that you just need to put your database on, right? You don't need to manage an operating system. You don't need to patch it. We're going to back it up for you, right?
So are you just one database? Is what's happening behind the scenes? Are you just one database then on a bigger server with a bunch of other
It
customers?
depends on what you're doing, right? It
Okay.
can be that way. So for Azure SQL Database, for example, you have a virtual SQL server that you then can have one or more databases on. And there's elastic pools, or there's all kinds of different plans in terms of how performance goes. But all of the hardware is abstracted from you, right? And that's the flip side of that, is that you don't have to deal with it. You don't get to deal with it. You run into things where if you have storage latency, for example, well, all you can do is go to a higher level plan that's a bunch of more CPUs and memory and so forth, as well as that. But that's the idea. Azure SQL Database is designed around single databases, so you can have multiple databases on a server, but you can't do like cross database queries. You don't have like SQL Server agent, link servers, things like that. It's really just a database that you're interacting with. Managed instance is the answer to that. That's more like an on-prem SQL Server version, right? That you have an instance, you have SQL Server agent, you have all of your databases, all of your different things. So there's pros and cons to both of those things. One of the things that I tell people, especially in Azure, when you're looking at platform as a service, is that these products are in the same family. They are not the same. Don't assume you can take your SQL Server database that you have on-prem and put it in managed instance or put it in Azure SQL Database and it's going to work the same. Because there are fundamental differences, right?
So if you wanted to move it, then it would be like a full migration?
It's more like a migration, more like a port almost than just moving it. And they're not huge differences, but they're just things that you need to be aware of, right? So one example, we had a customer a few years ago that moved from on-prem SQL Server to managed instance. And the issue that they ran into was authentication related. So on-prem, if you're using Windows authentication with Active Directory, you've got a domain controller sitting there next to you. You've got Kerberos tickets. Authentication is very fast, right? Milliseconds, right? Entra, or this was Azure Active Directory at the time, what they're now calling Entra, authentication as a web service call, right? So when you go to authenticate to your managed instance, it takes, several hundred milliseconds up to a second or two sometimes, right? Well, their application had been written in such a way that it wasn't using connection pooling correctly. So it was authenticating on every query. Well, with on-prem, with that domain controller sitting next to you, you don't even notice that. You introduce that web service call for authentication, right? So they had to fix their application to work with managed instance in a way that it wasn't optimal the way they had it anyway. But those are the kinds of things that you'll tend to run into between those platforms. It's just,
interesting.
Things
that you take for granted, just like authentication. Yeah, it's just like, why would this ever be an issue, and why would they make it quote unquote slower? But the reason it's slower is because it doesn't work in the same way at all. It's literally, like you said, a web service call now, because Entra is now its own cloud, if you will. Although it's all in the cloud, it's a separate service within the cloud. Yeah, interesting. Okay. And I imagine that there's a lot of that, because you get more and more things, turn on different things within Azure. It's connected, but it's not connected like it would be on-prem, like it's on the same network. So
the other thing is that, and this can be a positive thing, is that a lot of times new features are introduced in the platform as a service offerings first, right? Because it's just like an ISV that's a SaaS versus on-prem software, right? Your release cycles are different, so there's a lot of things that we have in SQL Server on-prem now that were born in the cloud version, right? Query Store, right? Query Store started with being in Azure SQL Database, right? Things like even availability groups, and for sure distributed availability groups, right? There's a lot of things that, we're just kind of under the hood. This is what they built for Azure platform as a service stuff. And they said, hey, let's add it to the on-prem product.
So they needed that just as they're rolling out the cloud. They're like, we need availability like this. And oh, by the way, these queries, we need to get a handle on what the heck's going on with all these queries. Let's build query store in.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Okay.
So you do get a lot of the newer features sooner.
Yeah.
Right. So like in SQL Server 2022 is another example. They introduced ledger tables, which is basically a blockchain-based way of tracking data changes. Right.
Does anyone use that? When I hear ledger, is that, I think, cryptocurrency? Does anyone use it for anything
we have
other
had
than
a
finance
couple of customers
stuff?
that have had use cases for it, for really for like an auditing type of thing, right? That they wanted to be able to track that. Well, ledger tables existed in Azure SQL Database long before SQL 2022. So that's another example of that.
So is that still the case now? Because I know that it seemed to me at least that once Azure started to become a thing, they pulled people off the SQL team, put them on the Azure SQL team or whatever. There's less focus on the traditional SQL product, more focus on, Azure SQL this, Azure SQL that, Azure. Is that still the case? It's just where they're focusing on just pouring resources into adding more features, more capabilities, more into Azure versus the traditional product.
It is, but it tends to be, the stuff eventually makes it to the traditional product, right? Because the thing is that, Microsoft, for good business reason, is Azure, right? This is subscription revenue, right? This is, especially, all these cloud vendors, right? With the platform as a service stuff, right? That's another downside, right? You build something on somebody's PaaS offering, you are vendor locked in a way that, you cannot run that on-prem anymore, right? But Microsoft also has some gigantic, huge customers that are on-prem. And they're like, we demand that you put this in the product, right? And so there's a balance there. It's funny, like you said, it's been Azure for the last probably 10 years. And I was talking to a friend who works at Microsoft, who's a program manager at a conference not too long ago. And she said, it used to be that to get any project approved, you had to put Azure in the name.
Sure.
Right. She said, that's now changed. Now everything has to be Copilot. Right.
Yeah. Cloud was eating the world, and now it's AI is eating the world.
Now that's what they have to do, right? So it's and those are all good things too. But there's a great example of that I think backfired. Azure Data Studio. Azure Data Studio is a port of Visual Studio Code that's like a leaner, meaner, faster JavaScript-based cross-platform SSMS, right? Well, they named it Azure Data Studio. And it works with on-prem databases the same way it does Azure databases. And so there were a lot of people I'd run into is like, oh, I haven't even looked at it because we're not on Azure, right? So, and they've since decided that they're going to sunset that product and integrate it back with Visual Studio Code. So
interesting.
That's Microsoft for you.
So just another thought on the cloud, and then we can wrap up here. So let's say I've made the commitment, I've gone into the cloud. Am I, other than me perhaps opening up my wallet and having to pour more pieces of paper out into Microsoft's wallet to pay for that, if I'm in the cloud, is it safe to assume that the cloud can then scale to whatever capacity I need it to scale as long as I pay for it?
Pretty much. We have some customers with SQL servers in the cloud on VM that are massive, 256 cores, 4 terabytes of memory, the largest SQL Server VMs that you can have. For the platform stuff, they have SQL Server Hyperscale. So, we've done some work for customers that were like, major retailers that like every point of sale transaction goes to Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, right? So
is that the managed version of it, or is it
managed? Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think when I talk to people about setting aside the financial part, right? cloud versus on-prem.
Which can be a big difference.
It can be a big difference.
But continue.
What I tell people, whether it's public cloud or private cloud providers, that the thing that you get from the cloud that you're not going to get as a small to mid-size, operation is you get enterprise class infrastructure and people supporting that infrastructure, right? We still occasionally run into customers that, hey, there's a rack of servers in the closet over here, right? That's the prime candidate for cloud, right? Because you're just not going to, that kind of on-prem, if it's not an actual data center, you're just not going to get the level of hardware support, connectivity, and so that's what the cloud really does, right? Is here's this, multi-million-dollar data center that I get this tiny little piece of, as opposed to investing, 7, 8, 9 figures in data centers, right? So that's an optimal.
Yeah. So one question here before we wrap up is just the difference, if there is any, other than the managed piece, between, say, an Amazon and an Azure, right? So you mentioned that if I put things into the Azure managed SQL, now it's basically, stuck there, if you will, because that's its own thing, and you can't easily just extract it out and migrate it to another platform. Is there an equivalent in Amazon that they have the equivalent? And
the public clouds, and let's just take AWS and Azure, are very, very similar in their offerings, right? And because they're such, tight competitors, they drive each other. One of them innovates and then the other one adds it, right? So they're almost the same. They have different names for things, right? Microsoft has a virtual network, Amazon has a VPC, which is a virtual private cloud, right? And so they're very, very close. Some have different offerings that the others do and things like that. When it comes to SQL Server, if you're running SQL Server on a VM, it's the same, right? You have a virtual machine in AWS, you have a virtual machine in Azure, you're installing whatever SQL Server version.
You can port from one to the other then if one doesn't work out. It's like, I don't like this for whatever reason.
No difference than on-prem, right? It's a database backup, right? Same exact version. In AWS, they have RDS, which is relational database services, which they have all kinds of different flavors, one of which is SQL Server. What's interesting about it is that SQL Server on RDS is going to be based on a specific on-prem version of SQL Server, because AWS can't create their own SQL Server. So RDS as a platform as a service is closer to on-prem SQL Server in a lot of ways than the Azure.
Is that because Microsoft is Microsoft and they own SQL, so they can just kind of do whatever they want?
Yeah, Amazon's paying for a SQL Server on-prem license for those RDS instances, right?
But they can't innovate in the same way as Azure because it's not their product.
Exactly. And that's why they have a lot of RDS databases that are open source based, that are their own databases, right? That they have innovated. So
I won't ask you to pick a favorite, but if you had to pick a favorite, you're going to say it depends. Yeah,
it does. I would probably lean to Azure because it's just, there's so much, Microsoft is Microsoft and they integrate everything. There's a lot of things that you can do in Azure that are harder to do in AWS with Windows.
And
with
price wise, are they fairly comparable?
I think they're very close. Okay. Yeah, they kind of have to be.
This was extremely useful. I thought coming in, it's like, well, I sort of know the answer to some of these questions, a lot of these questions, but even during this conversation, I've learned so much. So
great. Well, as you can tell, I can talk forever about probably any one of these topics, right? So appreciate you bearing with me and kind of redirecting me as needed, right?
No, this has been wonderful. So
always great to see you, and happy that I could participate.
Great.
Love the name of the podcast too.
Yay.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're less confused now.
That's right.
But there's always more data.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Randy.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in to Data and Confused. I really appreciate you listening. Please go ahead and subscribe as I get this podcast off the ground. I have a lot of amazing guests planned, industry experts and thought leaders from the tech and cybersecurity world. So look forward to seeing you in future episodes. Thank you.